I'm always getting messages from friends who say, "I saw this gaming laptop that looks awesome on the page, but when I actually got it, the screen was too dim or the battery died after an hour." It's a frustrating pattern. So many listings promise a full-on desktop experience, and then the real-world use feels more like a compromise. If you're on the fence about spending your hard-earned cash on a new gaming machine, this review is meant to keep you from making that mistake. Link is in the description if you want to check the product details on Amazon. I've spent the last few weeks juggling a few different laptops in a home office, a coffee shop, and a dorm room to see how the ASUS V16 actually holds up when you throw the kinds of games and multitasking you'll need every day. First off, let's talk about the kind of person who'll get the most out of the V16. If you're a college student or a remote worker who also streams a few esports titles in your spare time, the combination of a 16-inch 1920x1200 panel and a 144Hz refresh rate is pretty appealing. The screen sits in that sweet spot between a full HD laptop and a 4K monster, big enough to give you that immersive feel when you're in an open-world RPG, yet still portable enough to slip into a backpack. The high refresh rate smooths out fast shooters, and it actually matters when you're playing competitive games like Valorant or Apex Legends. The motion blur you usually see on a 60Hz display disappears, which can shave off that precious frame in tight engagements. The processor underneath the hood, an Intel Core i7240H, is part of Intel's newer hybrid architecture. In practice, that means the laptop can shift between performance cores for heavy tasks like rendering a 1080p video in Premiere and efficiency cores for background apps, like Discord or Spotify. I ran a quick side-by-side test with a few modern titles while keeping Chrome tabs open, and the system stayed responsive without the dreaded lag spike you sometimes see on older laptops when a game starts to hog resources. The 16 GB of RAM reinforces this smoothness. You can keep a handful of browser windows, a voice chat, and a game running together without hitting the memory ceiling. Now let's dive into the graphics side. The RTX 5060 sits in the mid-range tier, sporting 8 GB of GDDR7 memory. In real-world terms, that translates to solid 1080p performance across most recent releases. I tested titles ranging from Elden Ring to Fortnite, and the laptop consistently pushed between 60 and 70 frames per second on high settings. That's enough to enjoy a fluid experience, but you'll start to see the limits if you try to crank up ray tracing or push beyond 1080p resolution. The card does a decent job handling DLSS, which can boost frame rates while preserving image quality, but it's not going to match the raw horsepower of a higher-end RTX 3070. If you're planning to game at 1440p or higher with ultra settings, you'll need to dial back a few visual effects. Storage is another practical angle. The 512GB SSD is fast. Load times for games are sub 10 seconds on average, and the NVMe interface feels snappy when launching Windows apps. However, the total capacity can fill up quickly if you're juggling several large AAA titles, especially since modern games often exceed 100 GB each. I found myself pairing the laptop with an external SSD for backup and secondary game installs, which adds a bit of extra cost and a couple of cables to manage. If you're okay with managing your library or using cloud storage for less used titles, the internal drive works fine. Otherwise, you should budget for a larger drive later on. Battery life is often the elephant in the room for gaming laptops, and the V16 is no exception. On a light workload like browsing the web with the screen dimmed to 40%, you can stretch the charge to about 6 hours, which is respectable for a machine that houses a dedicated GPU. The moment you fire up a demanding game, the battery drops to around 2 hours of play before you need to plug back in. This isn't a surprise. The RTX series draws a fair amount of power, and the 16-inch panel's higher refresh rate doesn't help conserve juice. If you expect to game on the go without an outlet, consider a power bank or keep the charger nearby. One hidden trade-off that shows up with the V16 is the thermal design. The chassis is a matte black slab that looks sleek, but under load the fans kick in noticeably. The cooling system does its job. Temperatures hover in the low 80s Celsius during intensive gaming, yet you'll hear the fans spin louder than you might be comfortable with in a quiet CAF or a dorm night. For most users, the noise is a small price to pay for sustained performance, but if you're sensitive to fan whine while you're studying or streaming, it could be a distraction. The laptop also gets a bit warm on the palm rest side after long sessions, so an external cooling pad can